Okay, welcome to this podcast by the Grupo de Estudios Venezuela de Estados Unidos. My name is Dr. Micheal Tarver, and I'm a professor of history at Arkansas Tech University. We are joined today by Dr. Aaron Moulton from Stephen F. Austin State University in Texas, and we are glad to have him join us in our podcast series. Welcome, Dr. Moulton.
Thanks for having me.
We've been talking off camera before we got started about various Venezuelan U.S. Cold War issues, and I know that you've done some work on the Dominican government and its sort of role, its activities in Venezuela during the trienio of Acción Democrática. And so, what I'd like to do is to start off with maybe you talking about that issue and sort of introducing our readers to that topic, our listeners.
Glad to do it. Well, for a long time, especially during the later years of the Cold War, a lot of us scholars, we were focused on U.S. policy, U.S. views, U.S. goals, U.S. actions. So consequently, a lot of the scholarship inadvertently almost fetishized what did the U.S. do? And the downside of this was, even though it was crucial in giving us a better understanding of U.S. power and influence in the Western Hemisphere, it often marginalized the actions of other entities. Fortunately for me, when I went to the Dominican Republic to do one of my first big research runs back in late 2013, I inadvertently stumbled upon a whole bunch of collections, which revealed that the U.S. government was the only player in the Greater Caribbean. It turns out at the end of the Second World War, there was this vast democratic movement throughout the Greater Caribbean. And you see the toppling of dictatorships in El Salvador and Guatemala. You see what becomes the Trienio Adeco Acción Democrática governments in Venezuela. And you also have all of these anti-dictatorial exiles who are moving around between Venezuela, Cuba, Guatemala, hoping to overthrow dictatorships. And it turns out one of those dictators, Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, didn't really like this. Beginning in 1945, Trujillo had a central goal to undermine the Acción Democrática government in Venezuela. And it seems like the core reason of this foreign policy initiative of his was that the Acción Democrática, the AD government, had such figures like, well, Rómulo Betancourt, who was a vocal democratic activist, networked constantly with anti-Trujillo figures like Juan Bosch. And Trujillo feared that any government in the region who tolerated, who allowed, gave haven, sanctuary to his enemies were a threat to his regime, to his dictatorship. So what he did is he immediately allowed his regime to be a counter sanctuary for those opposed to Betancourt, Rómulo Gallegos, and the AD governments. And you had various figures like, well, we'll start with my favorite, Dr. Jose Vicente Pepper. Yes, Dr. Pepper was in fact a Venezuelan counter-revolutionary who was being funded by Trujillo. So Dr. Pepper received Trujillo's money. He received his largesse to not just publish anti-communist diatribes and pamphlets in the Dominican Republic that would be published throughout the Caribbean, but he also became an intermediary between anti-AD Venezuelans and Dominican officials under Trujillo. You had this array of groups. Got blanket on a few of the others at the moment. But what the result is that there emerge. Oh, one of my favorites, Pedro Estrada, of course. Pedro Estrada emerges in 46, 47, 48, and he also is this link between Trujillo and this network of anti-AD, anti-Betancourt figures. And what this allows to happen is Trujillo, by patronizing, by funding these counter-revolutionary Venezuelans, they in turn connect Trujillo's money and his resources and his armaments with figures in the Venezuelan military and Venezuelan politics who want to overthrow the AD government. And I detail in one of my works this array of anti-communist propaganda, various anti-government coup plots, but the most notable one is in early 1948 when Caracas is almost air bombed. That's true. In early 1948, Caracas and its capital is almost air bombed. It turns out one of the anti-Betancourt, anti-AD exiles, Leonardo Altuve de Carrillo. Altuve goes to the Dominican Republic, and he's networked, he's hooked up with Rafael Trujillo. And according to his own memoir, Altuve admits Trujillo basically snapped his fingers and had one of his officials bring out a suitcase of money. Like, this is something you think of in a bad Hollywood movie. But Altuve details in his memoir, and Rafael Trujillo gives Altuve about $100,000. Trujillo then tells Altuve, we're in trouble right now. The FBI is on me because of another attempt where I was helping figures try to mess with Venezuela. I don't want to go through the Dominican Republic. So why don't you go to my good friend, Anastasio Somoza, the Nicaraguan dictator? So Trujillo gives money and then sends Altuve over to Nicaragua. And Somoza sets Altuve up at Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua's easternmost port. And from there, Altuve, working with Pedro Estrada and a few others, they use this money to recruit a few U.S. mercenaries, to buy armaments, and most importantly, to buy explosives. And their goal was to send a small cadre, I believe no more than half a dozen planes, to fly from Nicaragua to Caracas, bomb the Venezuelan capital, and spark an internal uprising where they hoped the Venezuelan military would rise up and kick Betancourt and the AD government out of power. The only reason this is found out is because some Guatemalan intel agents were in Nicaragua, and they had been monitoring if Somoza would mess with Guatemala. Well, they pick up this info, they pick up this intel that, wait a minute, something's going down, but we don't think it's heading to Guatemala, we think it's heading to Venezuela. So serendipitously, when the Guatemalan government gets this information, they forward it to their allies in Venezuela, and Romulo Betancourt forwards it to the State Department, to the U.S. State Department, and the State Department responds and says, okay, this is a problem, we're going to shut this down. And the U.S. government intervenes. They put diplomatic pressure on Caribbean governments and tells them, do not air bomb each other. We've been dealing with this for the past 2 years. Can y'all chill out for just a moment? And fortuitously, this halts the air bombing. There's still this small military group that tries to rise up, but they're caught, they're kicked out. But the only reason it's not further investigated was when it's uncovered, the Nicaraguan dictator tells Altuve and tells Trujillo, I got it, guys. The U.S. government thinks I did it. They don't know you helped me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to confess to a couple things and tell them that I won't do anything else. That way we can prevent the U.S. from digging deeper and finding everything else out. Got it? So Somoza basically does this con game to the State Department to shield all the other Venezuelan exiles and Trujillo. And the long-term impact is not only from 45 to 48, do you see this cornucopia, this assortment of destabilizing plots that kind of radicalizes Venezuelan politics. But when the Venezuelan military in 1948 does its golpe, when they do perform their coup, the government that results, they welcome a lot of the Venezuelan exiles back in, and many of them, from Dr. Pepper to Pedro Estrada, had been working with Trujillo. And when they get new positions in what will be eventually become Marco Perez Jimenez's regime, they actually continue to network with the Dominican dictator. And there are even letters where they tell Dominican officials, from 45 to 48, you had our backs. We owe you one. Here's some intel we got on some of your enemies as well. So it's this from 45 to 48, the Dominican dictator sponsors all these sabotaging, radicalizing movements against the AD governments. And then when the AD is removed, you now have a new regime who owes part of its power, part of its allegiance to the Dominican dictator for the next years.
Did you uncover any direct evidence of contact between Trujillo and Delgado Chaval or Pérez Jiménez during the trienio? In other words, when they were part of the government itself?
Not at all. Not at all. From 40, and see, that's what's very fascinating. It seems, and when you look at a lot of this public speeches, and especially the conversations between the Venezuelan junta's leaders and U.S. officials, they don't say they owe Trujillo, and there's no evidence they networked with Trujillo. Instead, what they argue is for the past years, the AD government has been a poor leader. We've had all these issues. We've had all of our younger officers basically doing all these attempted coups and network. And one of the best examples I had was during the 48 air bombing failure. The AD government distributes arms to Venezuelan citizens because they argue we're under attack, we have to defend ourselves. Well, this is a huge insult to the Venezuelan military. The military has always believed it's the one who has the responsibility to defend the nation. So when you have the AD government distributing arms to non-military people, many military officers believe it's an insult, as if you don't trust us to do our duty, you don't believe in us. And when you combine this with the 3-year-long bleeding of Venezuelan military officials and officers who have slowly over the years turned on the AD government, and some of them end up working with Trujillo, it seems like this junta believes if we do this coup, we're in charge, everyone will leave us alone. And what I did uncover was that one Venezuelan officer, he's unknown because he meets with Trujillo's journalist Stanley Ross. But one Venezuelan military officer approaches Trujillo's journalist and says, we're going to do a coup. If we take over, we won't mess with your government. Leave us alone. And it seemed to have been this way to say, look, we're cleaning things up. Could you not intervene with us anymore? And it's almost like this conscious realization that Trujillo keeps sabotaging us. Trujillo keeps messing with us. If we continue to be unstable, foreign powers will keep intervening. If we do this coup, we will get the house in order. So it seems to fall very in line with what had been the Venezuelan military's ideology.
Okay, thank you. What other sort of information can you share with perhaps things that you've just looked at, really, of just Venezuela in the early parts of the Cold War?
In the early parts of the Cold War, it's very fascinating how Venezuela receives a lot of the regional attention. And that's very odd because in the scholarship, we've often turned to the other hotspots, Guatemala, Cuba especially. But for many in the Caribbean, Venezuela was the cornerstone. It was the load bearer because of its oil resources, because of its position at the very tip of South America. Many governments, and not just Mexico, not just Dominican Republic, but also the US and also Britain. They were especially worried about possible communist influence, Soviet penetration of Venezuela with this fear. Whoever gets Venezuela will have Venezuela's oil wealth. And whoever has Venezuela's oil wealth, they'll be able to fund, whether it's the right or the left, they'll be able to fund whatever movement, whatever group they support. So what's fascinating is from 48 to 57, a lot of the dictators in the regime in the Caribbean basin, they're very happy because thanks to the Venezuelan junta and eventually Pérez Jiménez's leadership, they believe Venezuela's on their side. So they're glad to network. You have the Nicaraguan dictator, you have the Honduran governments, you have the Dominican dictator, you'll have the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. They're all network and share intelligence with Pérez Jiménez and the Venezuelan military intelligence, most notably Seguridad Nacional under Pedro Estrada, who's a buddy of all these dictators. But when Betancourt takes over, All the dictators are scared to death because now that Betancourt's back in power in 58, now that the so-called center left is taking over Venezuela, that oil money can be used against the dictators. And this is one of the reasons what you find is in 1958, when Betancourt is beginning to cement his power in Venezuela, you have Jose Figueres of Costa Rica. You have the Cuban Authenticos, who were, for those who don't know, the Cuban Authenticos were Cubans who they were not completely on the side of Fidel Castro in 52, 58, but they opposed the dictator Batista more. So there was this unofficial alliance between the Authenticos and Castro's allies. Well, these Authenticos and Castro's allies and other democratic groups, they constantly go to Betancourt and ask, could you give us money to overthrow dictators in the region? So Venezuela is this very important pillar of Caribbean politics, where everyone fears wherever Venezuela goes, the rest of the region might go.
The thing that kind of fascinates me to some regard is, for a long time, the only works that were coming out about Venezuelan history in the U.S. in particular had to do with either the petroleum, or they had to do with, some sort of, stable democratic government that was just kind of there. They didn't really look at the foundations of Venezuelan democracy. They didn't really look a lot at U.S.-Venezuelan relations during this time, other than perhaps, when it was key to U.S. Interests, like during the Alliance for Progress and these sorts of things, when Kennedy went down there. But in the last, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 years, there's kind of been a resurgence of younger interest, like yourself, in topics dealing with Venezuela. What do you think has sort of led to that resurgence in interest in something other than petroleum?
I'm going to be honest, it's timing. And I'm going to be honest, you say younger, that's not the best term. I think it's that we get a cheat, as I joke. If we look back at the broader scholarship, well, during many Cold War years, it was near impossible to get documents that had specific details on national security. I mean, if you look at the works of people like one of my favorite scholars, Stephen Rabe, when he went to Venezuela and did his first book on OPEC, it was groundbreaking because he did as much as he could. But against his scholarship, against his timing, was the fact that he did not have the access to key Venezuelan sources. It's not that he didn't try. It's that you literally couldn't get them. It was impossible. Well, fast forward to mid-90s, to the 2000s. Well, now that the Cold War is starting to become more of our history, not just the history itself, and now that there is a liberalization and democratization of collections, more of us are now able to get in these collections. And first of all, one, people like me get to cheat because we have the amazing works of people like Stephen Rabe and you and others who already kind of laid the blueprint. They already have the broad contours, and 99% of it is spot on. And now what that means is those of us, and again, I believe one of your guests has been Gustavo Saucedo, but Gustavo, me, Aragorn Storm Miller, this new crop, if you want to call it that, it's not that we're new, it's just that we happen to be born at this perfect moment where when we decide to go to Venezuela, when we decide to go to the Dominican Republic, when we decide to go to the Kennedy Library, it's, y'all just declassifies these documents? Well, we'll give it a shot. And when we get into them, it gives us that brand new perspective. And the best, and like you mentioned, petroleum, everyone cares about Venezuelan petroleum, U.S.-Venezuelan relations. Well, in the United States, our National Archives and a lot of our presidential libraries has that 50-year declassification process under FOIA. So this meant that documents from the 40s, 50s, 60s were being declassified 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, perfect for when we come in. Combine this with the fact that more and more countries have open archives, you get these fascinating new insights from those of us who are fortunate and privileged enough to travel to an archive and stumble upon the right collection.
You're right, and I know that when I was just recently at the Truman Library. I mean, I was going through documents, and many of these were just declassified within the last 3 or 4 years that I was looking at. It's like, wow, if I had this, in 1991 when I was
Right?
working on things that it could have been, a lot different, or even my work on the Venezuelan guerrilla movement in the 60s, that was from the 1980s. And again, it's like, where was this source back then? But of
Right?
course, yeah, it was all still classified. And so I agree. I mean, there's some NSC reports that had been released since then, specifically with Venezuela, that I have been able to use, and I will use in my work going forward. Well, anything else you wanted to add to our podcast?
No, I would just say for any listeners who are really interested in picking out a new topic or really understanding the nuances of Venezuelan democracy, U.S. policy, this is the opportune moment. You have a flourishing literature from figures like Edgardo Mondolfi Gudat, Gustavo Saucedo. Hopefully my work might be able to help people to dig even deeper to anything I found. And by combining our research, the research of you, Edwin Lewin, Winfield Burgraff, Stephen Rabe, you can not only build that foundational material thicker, but when you stop by the Kennedy Library, the Johnson Library, or even, like you said, the Truman Library, well, maybe there's someone listening who, hey, we didn't mention the Eisenhower Library. You might want to take a swing over there. The people in Abilene are very hospitable, generous with their time. So there's going to be some great sources. Add in the fact that you have declassified material at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. Remember, not the one in DC, so they don't pull your car. It's the one over in College Park, better parking, I assure you. And if you're fortunate enough that there are great collections in the National Archives in Mexico. You can head to the National Archives in Costa Rica, the Archivo Nacional de Costa Rica in San Jose, considering the relations between Costa Rica and Venezuela. We are encouraging people to go to Panama because Panama is kind of like Venezuela. It's often been in the shadow of U.S. history, but Panama had its own dynamic foreign policy throughout the Caribbean. I've worked in the Dominican Republic. I've worked in Cuba. If you're fortunate enough to go there, as long as you follow the rules, be respectful, do what you do. And finally, there are some great works out there if you want to go do some stuff in Britain. Always fascinating to get one of those non-Western Hemisphere countries and get their perspectives and sources in the game.
Yeah, I used a good bit of British documents in my World War One work and they were quite useful, and I enjoyed that. And yeah, I can't imagine the folks like Edwin Lewin and John Lombardi, that were writing so many decades ago with really limited materials that we now have at our disposal.
And what's truly fascinating is they had less than we have, but think about all the connections they made. They built so much, and it's almost funny that as we historians were often a very nihilistic bunch, because we kind of admit we write a book with our name on it, but we know someone's going to come in a few years with a new document, a new source, and they're going to change it up. But it's kind of fun to add to this flow where Stephen Rabe inspired my work. Winfield Burgraff was a huge helper. In fact, he was kind enough when I was traveling to Missouri to let me in. He took me to his basement where he had his Venezuelan history collection. And that's where I actually got my copy of Leonardo Altuve's memoir that led to my air bombing stuff. And then when I went to DC, when I went to the Dominican Republic, I was like, oh, whoa, this is even more. Winfield, this is awesome. And hopefully in a few years, there will be people who then say, yeah, Moulton had something, but also there's even more. And I think that's kind of the joy of not just being the student of history, but then becoming a mentor and sharing your work with future students as well.
Well, I agree. And that's part of it. And it's what we, try to instill in our students, the fact that, we have to make conclusions based on the fact that we know that tomorrow everything may change when new evidence becomes available. And what we believe today is accurate may not be so in the future.
A 60-40 hope.
Yeah, there you go. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Aaron Moulton, for joining us on this podcast, and I look forward to your work, and we will see you soon.
You as well. Take it easy, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Aaron.